He stepped onto the stage barefoot, black, blind, 16 years old, and without saying a word, shattered everything the music world thought it understood. No pedigree, no press, just a sound that cut through centuries of exclusion. What followed wasn't a performance, it was a reckoning. This is the story of Elijah Rowe. Yes, Elijah, whose silence reached further than applause, and whose refusal to be seen made the whole world stop and finally listen with something it had long forgotten: the heart. It was supposed to be just another rehearsal at the Lincoln Music Auditorium in Chicago, where velvet seats lined the aisles and board members whispered over cappuccinos about donation tiers and prestige. The elite had gathered for a private showcase preview, an evening meant to affirm tradition, polish, and pedigree. But what unfolded instead fractured the very silence those walls had long protected. The stage lights had barely warmed when a 16-year-old boy stepped forward, tall but lean, dark-skinned, and wearing a thrifted black suit that hung loosely at the shoulders. In his hand, a chipped white cane. His name was Elijah Rowe. Blind since infancy, no record label, no family name etched into the institution's donor plaque, no official slot on the program. He didn't arrive with applause. He arrived with hesitation. He had been mistakenly allowed on stage during a final piano sound check. The Steinway Model D Grand, worth more than most homes in the city, was still being tuned. That's when the voice cracked through the quiet like a whip. "Get him off the stage. This is not a public audition." It came from Bennett Langston, an icon of modern classical performance, who stood just off stage in an Armani overcoat, his silver tie gleaming under the lights. Langston's words carried weight, not just because of his fame, but because they echoed the unspoken rules of a world where mastery is assumed to come dressed in legacy. The room shifted. Some looked away. A few smirked. No one interrupted. But Elijah didn't flinch. He simply placed his cane aside, sat down at the piano, and rested his fingers on the keys, not with entitlement, but with a kind of reverence. What came next wasn't a recital. It was a rupture. His hands moved like they were drawing breath, not chasing notes. The melody was unfamiliar, an improvised lament so raw and human that even the lighting tech paused mid-cue. In that moment, no one saw a boy. They heard something that made them question what they'd been trained to admire. Within 48 hours, a leaked cell phone video, filmed by a young intern, hit over 2 million views. And by the end of the week, the conversation had shifted. Not about talent, but about who gets to be heard. Before the lights of Lincoln Auditorium and the viral uproar that followed, Elijah Rowe existed in the corners of systems, of rooms, of expectations. He was just another name buried in a district file, a black teenager from Baton Rouge with full vision loss, a worn-out keyboard from a thrift store, and no formal training. But even that doesn't explain how he ended up at Eastbrook. At 13, Elijah was placed into the Eastbrook Institute for Sound Arts through a community outreach pilot, a program that looked noble on paper but functioned more like a quota checklist for grant compliance. The brochure described the pilot as an opportunity for unconventional learners, but inside the school, it was treated like a storage closet for students who didn't fit the mold. Eastbrook was a place built for legacy. The campus itself looked like a transplanted European conservatory, arched windows, mahogany staircases, and performance halls named after donors. Most students there carried names you'd find on symphony playbills or inside Lincoln Center brochures. Elijah arrived with a backpack full of cracked braille sheets, a patched-up hoodie, and a digital recorder that barely held a charge. He wasn't enrolled in official courses. He wasn't even assigned a practice room. Instead, Elijah was categorized as a non-performing observer, which meant he could sit outside classrooms but not participate. He had no sheet music, no private lessons, and no performance slots. For most students, the Institute was a launch pad to Juilliard or Salzburg. For Elijah, it became a master class in being invisible. He spent hours on the floor outside Room 204, Advanced Composition, where Professor Voss taught tonal structures to students who all had mentors, agents, and family foundations. Elijah sat cross-legged with his back to the wall, listening through the thin door. He began memorizing the tempo of each student's exercises, learning who had control over legato by the sound of their hesitation. He tapped rhythms into his thigh and mapped harmonic shifts like braille across his chest. No one yelled at him, but no one welcomed him either. It was the kind of exclusion that doesn't leave bruises, just erosion. The kind that teaches you to walk slower in the hallway so you're never asked where you're going. To say sorry, even when you're just breathing. The emotional toll was slow and cumulative. Elijah's presence made people uncomfortable, though no one ever said it aloud. A counselor once told him, "You're brave for being here." But it sounded more like a dismissal than praise. At night in his dorm, a converted maintenance room near the back of the building, he'd sit in the dark, running his fingers over the cracked keyboard, not practicing, just remembering what the day felt like. But Elijah didn't fight for space. He listened harder. He noticed things most students never would. The third-floor piano had a looser, damper pedal, which made low notes reverberate better for improvisation. The second-floor practice wing carried sound differently after 6 p.m. because the janitor's vacuum created a natural reverb chamber. Elijah started composing inside his head, full pieces built from memory, silence, and breath. Eventually, he caught the attention of one teacher, Dr. Lenore Foster, a retired ethnomusicologist who returned once a week to teach a seminar on sound symbolism in African diasporic traditions. Unlike others, she didn't brush past Elijah. One afternoon she found him sketching a chord sequence with his index finger on the concrete floor. She didn't ask what he was doing. She just knelt beside him and listened. That was the first time someone met Elijah where he was, without fixing, without fanfare. Their sessions began unofficially in the archive room, surrounded by old field recordings and dust-coated drum replicas. There, Dr. Foster introduced him to the idea that music didn't have to follow rules written by empires. It could be rhythm scraped from a broken chair leg, or melody drawn from a rusted fence humming in the wind. She didn't teach scales. She told stories about Yoruba griots, New Orleans funeral marches, and the polyrhythms of Ghanaian Capan logo. Elijah didn't just learn music theory. He felt its lineage in his bones. Every beat he recreated wasn't an assignment, it was a reclamation. Still, his presence stirred discomfort. A few faculty members complained privately, saying he was receiving special treatment. Some suggested his auditory learning style was a liability in a competitive setting. And when Dr. Foster attempted to nominate Elijah for a regional youth showcase, the board declined. The rejection email was 2 sentences long, no feedback, no justification, just a closed door with brass hinges. That moment didn't break Elijah, but it did mark him. He didn't cry. He didn't confront anyone. He simply recorded a voice memo to himself that night. Maybe they don't need to open the door. Maybe I'll find another way in. What no one realized was that Elijah wasn't just preparing for a recital. He was preparing to reframe what music could be. He wasn't studying Chopin to earn applause. He was studying silence, learning how it morphs in a room that's never expected you to speak. The first lesson didn't begin with a piano. It began with silence. In a forgotten wing of the Eastbrook Institute's library basement, past rows of locked cabinets and discarded sheet music, Dr. Lenore Foster turned the light switch off and let the room dim to near darkness. She guided 14-year-old Elijah Rowe to an old bench, the kind covered in scuffs and lacquer cracks. No sound, no introduction, just the creak of the wooden stool beneath them. "You don't need to see the music," she whispered. "You need to feel where it lives." That moment marked the beginning of what would become Eastbrook's quietest rebellion. Elijah wasn't on the roster. There were no forms, no credit hours, no institutional approval. But every Wednesday at 4:30 p.m., after Dr. Foster's official lectures ended and the students filed out with their annotated scores and scholarship offers, she returned to the archives. Elijah was always already there, his white cane resting near the wall, his palms pressed against the wooden floor, listening for the vibration of every footstep above. He didn't learn theory the way others did. Foster didn't show him notation. She tapped time signatures on his forearm. She used silence to explain syncopation. She let him sit inside a West African talking drum case, just to feel how the air moved between beats. These weren't music lessons. They were language courses in something older than curriculum. Elijah didn't need repetition. Once was enough. He heard the difference between sorrow and regret in a single note, between longing and apology in the placement of a chord. The way Foster saw it, his mind wasn't just interpreting music. It was translating unspoken emotion. They practiced in storage rooms, in the boiler hallway, under stairwells. Wherever sound could echo, they found meaning. He began composing pieces using ambient noise as percussion, radiator hisses, door hinge squeaks, even his own breath. One night, he recreated a full rhythmic suite based entirely on the footsteps of students walking past his dorm window. The title, Passing Privilege. But as Elijah grew more confident, so did the whispers. Faculty members noticed Dr. Foster's extended hours. A few students began asking why the blind scholarship kid got access to faculty beyond his placement. The unspoken discomfort around him was no longer quiet. It echoed through boardrooms and faculty lounges, wrapped in polite terms like inconsistent access and pedagogical boundaries. When Lenore tried to nominate Elijah for a summer residency program in New Orleans centered on Black improvisational traditions, the submission was returned unread. The committee claimed his application lacked formal instructional milestones. Foster knew the truth. Elijah's existence challenged their systems. They had spent years building walls out of standards. Elijah played between the cracks. She refused to stop teaching him, but she changed how she taught. She handed him a handheld recorder and gave him an assignment: walk through the city and collect sounds. Not melodies, not instruments, sounds, church bells, broken escalators, a man whistling near a train station. Then they would meet in the basement and reconstruct what those sounds meant emotionally. One week, Elijah brought a clip of a wind chime tangled in a tree branch. When Foster asked what it made him feel, he paused, then said, "It sounds like someone trying to remember who they used to be." That sentence shook her more than anything he'd played, because it was also her story. She had once toured with avant-garde ensembles across 3 continents, but academia had worn her down. She once composed to create. Now she taught to survive. Elijah's intuition, his emotional precision, wasn't just reviving music. It was reviving her. That winter, they composed a duet together. No sheet music, no title, just a call and response built from breath and floor taps. They never recorded it, but Foster kept the tempo pattern etched into her notebook like scripture. She knew the clock was ticking. Elijah's increasing visibility created unease. An anonymous letter reached the board, accusing Foster of compromising institutional standards by mentoring an unregistered student. An inquiry was launched. Foster was asked to adjust her teaching methods to preserve faculty alignment. She nodded through the meeting, then returned to Elijah that night and handed him a file. "I'm leaving at the end of the semester," she said. "They don't want you in the building, but I think the world needs you out of it." Inside the file was a rough draft of an audio portfolio submission, 10 minutes of raw improvisation recorded during one of their late sessions. She had already submitted it to a small independent festival in Oregon, known for spotlighting unconventional voices. He didn't ask if he would win. He didn't even ask what came next. He just asked, "Do I need to dress a certain way?" Foster smiled. "Just make sure whatever you wear doesn't silence you." A month later, while most of the school was preparing for spring showcase auditions, a plain envelope arrived in the mailroom with no official seal. Inside was a one-line message. "Elijah Rowe has been selected to open the Sound Horizons showcase." Foster didn't show the email to anyone, but that night, after locking her office door, she sat alone and played back the recording of their last lesson, not because she wanted to hear it, but because she missed the silence between their notes. The Sound Horizons showcase was supposed to be Elijah Rowe's quiet beginning, a low-profile performance in a converted warehouse in Portland. No press, no jury box, just a dozen artists exploring non-traditional sound and a folding chair stage surrounded by old speakers. But a week before he was due to fly out, the email arrived. "We regret to inform you." No explanation, no mention of his submitted track, no reference to his name, just 3 sentences that ended in silence. Dr. Lenore Foster didn't cry. She'd seen enough gatekeeping to know when rejection wasn't about readiness. It was about discomfort. Elijah's file had no conservatory letterhead, no polished footage, no pedigree, just a blind black teenager speaking in soundscapes, not sonatas. "I guess they weren't ready to listen," Elijah said that night. He was sitting cross-legged in the archive room, tapping a pencil rhythmically on an old drum shell. Foster nodded but stayed silent. Her silence wasn't resignation, it was calculation. She pulled out a weathered USB drive and copied their last session. 10 minutes of Elijah improvising with breath, taps, and a broken keyboard. No title, no edits. Just one line added to the file name, Rowe Unfiltered. What neither of them realized was that someone else had already heard Elijah. Jared Coles, a 21-year-old work-study student at Eastbrook, was one of the overnight janitorial crew. He'd been in the hallway that evening, swapping out light bulbs and scraping gum off the stair railings. He paused outside the storage room when he heard something strange. Music? Yes, but not in the traditional sense. It sounded like a memory being rebuilt out of wreckage. He didn't know who was playing. He just knew it didn't belong behind that door. So he took out his phone and recorded the last 3 minutes. Later that night, Jared uploaded the clip to a small online forum for experimental musicians. No title, no backstory, just a caption. "I don't know who this is, but I felt something." The video sat for a day. Then someone reshared it on TikTok. Then a jazz saxophonist in Chicago reposted it on Instagram with the words, "You ever feel like you've been holding your breath your whole life, and then a stranger exhales for you?" By day 3, the clip had hit 500,000 views. By day 5, it was featured on the front page of Reddit's r/music. People began searching for the source. Who is the blind kid with the broken keyboard? Why isn't he in Carnegie? Where does talent like this go to disappear? And then someone found an old-school newsletter from Eastbrook buried in their digital archive. One mention, one blurry photo. Elijah Rowe, Community Outreach Program. The comments exploded. Within 48 hours, "Number Let Elijah Play" was trending. The Eastbrook administration tried to distance itself. No public comment, no acknowledgement, but someone on the faculty leaked the rejection letter from the Sound Horizons showcase. Music bloggers picked it up. A headline on a popular arts site read, "Rejected for not fitting the format, the tragedy of Elijah Rowe." But not everyone saw it as a tragedy. Viola Adamu, a Nigerian-British conductor known for breaking orchestral conventions, posted a video of herself reacting to the clip. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "This is not a performance. This is a revelation. We teach young musicians to follow rules, but this boy reminds us what the rules were meant to protect. Soul." From there, the fire spread. Not like gossip, like a movement. Elijah didn't tweet. He didn't film a follow-up. He barely checked his phone. He just kept showing up to the archive room. But the room felt different now. Fuller. Like the space itself was listening. Then came the email that changed everything. The International Harmonic Assembly, a global collective of curators, educators, and composers, reached out with an invitation. We would be honored if Elijah Rowe would open this year's Harmony Futures Forum in New York City. Foster read the email twice before telling him. Elijah sat still, his hands resting on his knees. "Do they know who I am?" he asked. "They don't need to," she said. "They heard who you are." But that moment of light brought new shadows. Commentators debated whether Elijah was a symbol or a fluke. Think pieces appeared overnight. One writer argued, "We must be careful not to over-romanticize pain." Another asked, "Why must black excellence be born from exclusion to be validated?" And while much of the world celebrated Elijah, Eastbrook's board called an emergency meeting. They were not prepared for the scrutiny. Some members pushed for a public apology. Others insisted it was best to wait it out. Meanwhile, Elijah rehearsed in a friend's basement in South Side Chicago. No lighting, no acoustic panels, just peeling drywall and a second-hand piano with half a pedal. He didn't rehearse to impress anyone. He rehearsed to remember what it felt like to be invisible and to decide what kind of sound should follow silence. The Harmony Futures Forum wasn't known for spectacle. It was the kind of gathering where composers wore dark turtlenecks, conductors nodded through panel debates, and music theorists debated the ethics of drone-generated symphonies. held annually at the Century Sound Theater in Manhattan, it wasn't about applause, it was about authority. So when the name Elijah Rowe appeared on the opening slot, right above Bennett Royce, the celebrated maestro of post-minimalist piano, the industry didn't know what to do. Royce had never shared a program with someone unknown, especially not someone uncredentialed, especially not someone who had become famous through a cell phone video filmed next to a mop bucket. "I will not go after him," Royce reportedly told the forum director. "I've spent 40 years building a reputation. I won't be his encore." The director's reply was simple. "You're welcome to decline." Royce didn't. He couldn't. Not in this climate. Not when the forum had sold out its entire venue in 36 hours for the first time in its history. And not when over 70 media outlets were now covering what they dubbed the moment where legacy meets lived experience. Backstage, Royce was silent. He didn't shake hands. He didn't warm up. He stood at the side curtain in tailored black, arms crossed, watching a blind black teenager in worn sneakers and a navy hoodie step onto a stage that had once only welcomed royalty in loafers and cufflinks. Elijah didn't smile. He didn't wave. He walked to the Steinway and sat down like it was an empty chair in his grandmother's kitchen. No sheet music, no introduction, just fingers poised. He didn't begin with a classical piece. He began with a hum, low, sustained, like breath being measured inside memory. Then came chords that pulsed like a heartbeat 1 octave below panic. He built phrases from pauses. He let silence act as punctuation. It wasn't perfect, but it was unmistakably human. In the control booth, the audio engineer stopped making notes. In the audience, you could hear clothing shift, but not a single cough. At minute 5, a woman in the back row began to cry, not because of what she heard, but because of what she hadn't heard in a long time. Honesty. When Elijah finished, he didn't bow. He stood, nodded slightly toward the left stage wing, and walked off. No dramatic lighting, no extended ending, just a boy with a cane. Walking back into the quiet, Royce remained in the wings, unmoving. For the first time in years, he didn't look at the instrument. He looked at the floor, because for the first time he didn't know what to play. His performance followed 20 minutes later. It was technically flawless. His fingers still moved like water. But something in the room had changed. His interpretation felt calculated, practiced, prepared for cameras. In contrast, Elijah's set felt like it had been carved in real time, pulled from beneath the skin rather than printed from a staff. Afterward, critics were gentle with Royce. They used words like restrained, deliberate, and elegant. But readers weren't fooled. The headlines told a different story. Legacy disrupted. Elijah Rowe steals the stage from the icon. When a whisper outsings the applause. What Royce perfected, Rowe made real. By the end of the week, Elijah's performance had been replayed over 14 million times on social media. Schools across the country began holding listening sessions. Students in Los Angeles and Minneapolis started programs they called silent hours, inviting their peers to sit in silence before playing anything, an idea borrowed directly from Elijah's set. Meanwhile, Royce found himself increasingly shut out of his usual institutions. Invitations grew quieter. His masterclass was removed from a prestigious conservatory's curriculum after students petitioned to replace it with sessions focused on accessibility, improvisation, and emotional fluency in music. In private, Royce became a ghost in his own circle. He was still technically revered, but he was no longer required. He issued no public statement about Elijah. Not when the forum announced a new inclusion initiative named after Rowe. Not when Elijah was featured in a short documentary by an indie film team. Not even when Elijah was nominated for the New Voices Medal by the International Sound Council, an honor traditionally reserved for conservatory graduates and film composers. But something shifted. One late night, weeks after the performance, Royce was seen entering a community center in Harlem, where Elijah had begun mentoring visually impaired students. No cameras, no press. He didn't speak. He didn't perform. He sat in the back of the room while Elijah guided a young girl through a tactile rhythm exercise, her hands drumming lightly on a rubber mat. Royce watched, and for the first time in decades, he listened. The marquee outside Carnegie Union Hall glowed against the Manhattan dusk, banners draped in gold, and Violet announced the Global Sound Gala, an annual event live-streamed in over 40 countries. That year, the theme was Listening Across Borders, but no one expected the opening note would come from a boy who never learned to read sheet music. Elijah Rowe stood alone in the back hallway, hands in the pockets of his pressed black slacks. His cane leaned against the wall beside him. The old keyboard from his first composition had been left behind in Baton Rouge, but its keys still lived in his memory. A soft knock broke the stillness. A volunteer whispered, "You're on in 3." He didn't nod. He just exhaled slowly, anchoring himself to the silence. In the main hall, guests shuffled in their seats. Diplomats, musicians, critics, and cultural figures filled the velvet rows. A few whispered to each other about Elijah's past, the video, the backlash, the forum showdown. Others had never heard his name. Then the lights dimmed. The MC stepped out and read the introduction. Tonight's opening performance is by Elijah Rowe, United States. No biography, no achievements, no credentials, just a name. The spotlight swept across the polished stage as Elijah stepped forward. No entourage, no stylist, just a slim teenager in an untailored jacket and smooth-soled shoes, walking barefoot to the piano to feel the grain of the wood beneath his steps. The audience grew still. He sat at the Steinway, placed one hand lightly on the frame, and closed his eyes. He didn't begin with a dramatic chord. He didn't gesture for applause. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small wooden flute, weathered and unvarnished, on top of the piano. Then he began. The first sound was not a note, but a rest. A breath held so long the audience leaned forward, unsure if it had started or if they were waiting. Then gently, his right hand pressed a single G. The note rang hollow, like a memory long buried but still aching. Then came the left, minor thirds that staggered downward like steps in a flooded hallway. He didn't play fast. He played close. His hands moved as if pulling fabric from water, slow, heavy, personal. Each chord was a sentence unfinished, each silence a question he wasn't sure would be answered. The room filled not with music, but with confession. At minute 4, a hush fell so thick, even the sound engineers stopped adjusting. The cameras zoomed in, but Elijah didn't shift. He didn't perform. He testified. Around minute 7, he lifted his hands from the keys. The audience braced for applause, but instead he picked up the flute. No amplification, no backing track. He lifted it to his lips and blew. What came out wasn't a melody in the traditional sense. It was a pulse, A flicker of breath shaped into tone, shaped into longing. It quivered, dipped, stretched thin, then collapsed into stillness again. And when it ended, no final chord, no crescendo, no cue. The room didn't applaud. They didn't need to. The silence said more than clapping ever could. Then from the balcony, a single person stood. Then another, then the rest. Not fast, not choreographed, like snow rising instead of falling. Elijah didn't bow. He didn't wait. He stepped away from the piano, left the flute behind, and walked off stage like someone walking home. Slow, unshaken, carrying something that hadn't been taken from him this time. By the next morning, the clip of his performance had gone live on the gala's official stream. Within 12 hours, it passed 5 million views. By the end of the week, it was played during a morning assembly in a Johannesburg township school, in a therapeutic music workshop for combat veterans in North Carolina, and at a deaf-accessible arts center in Kyoto, where audiences listened to the video by placing their palms against subwoofers. Music critics tried to describe what they'd seen. Some failed. Others wrote long-form essays with titles like The Absence That Became Sound, a performance without permission. The gala didn't begin. It awoke. Meanwhile, Eastbrook Conservatory quietly released a single statement. We congratulate Elijah Rowe on his recent performance and wish him well in his future endeavors. But the public didn't forget. Alumni began speaking out about the conservatory's treatment of students from non-traditional backgrounds. A petition demanding structural reform gained over 60,000 signatures in a week. Private donors pulled their funding, and across the internet, young musicians began uploading their own Elijah pieces, improvised tracks in dark dorm rooms and makeshift studios. No edits, no filters, just truth. The gala committee, unprepared for the emotional tsunami, issued a second statement. We are rethinking what it means to open a global stage. Elijah Rowe reminded us that music doesn't need amplification. It needs permission to exist in its rawest form. But Elijah gave no interviews. He issued no statements. He turned down offers from 5 major labels. He didn't log in to social media. He boarded a train out of New York with a worn duffel bag, a small recorder, and the flute. When asked by the ticket clerk where he was headed, he just smiled. Somewhere quiet, somewhere I can still hear myself think. 3 days after the gala, Elijah Rowe vanished from the public eye. The performance had sparked something far larger than expected. His name trended for 6 days across platforms. Industry heads called him the sound of the future. A leading recording label hand-delivered a 30-page contract, printed on linen stock, offering him a multi-album deal, national press, and a private studio built to accommodate his blindness. A producer left a bouquet of white orchids at the door of the small boarding house where Elijah was last seen, but no one received a reply. The people who knocked were told he left just before dawn, said he wasn't looking for a microphone. There was no media tour, no interviews, no red carpet. The boy who made the world pause with sound had walked into silence again. What most didn't understand was that for Elijah, music was never about being heard by many. It was about making one person feel seen. Fame didn't tempt him. In fact, it unsettled him. After years of being invisible, the sudden flood of attention felt like another form of distortion. He didn't fear recognition. He feared reduction. While offers poured in, Elijah quietly moved into a rented cabin outside a village in northern Vermont. near the edge of a forest preserve. No cell signal, no reporters, no distractions. Just an old upright piano with 3 cracked keys, a window facing a frozen lake, and a wind that carried sound like it had nowhere else to go. Locals spotted him occasionally, buying fruit at the co-op, borrowing books on acoustics and weather patterns. He never mentioned who he was, and most didn't ask. But he wasn't idle. Elijah began composing again, not for audiences, but for people who had no stage. He mailed handwritten scores to children in pediatric wards, to teens in juvenile centers, to elders in assisted living homes. No return address, just a single line at the bottom of each piece. Play this when you feel like no one remembers your sound. Some of the recipients uploaded their interpretations online. Others kept them private. But each one carried the unmistakable weight of his voice. Raw, quiet, honest. Then something unexpected happened. Teachers across the country began designing music classes inspired by Elijah's approach. A high school in Oakland created a listening before sound module. A middle school in Atlanta formed an ensemble where students wrote compositions using only breath, silence, and the ambient sounds of their schoolyard. A prison education program in Ohio added a session called Echoes of Self, based on Elijah's technique of transforming memory into music without formal notation. No textbook existed, but his influence spread. And then came the letter from the Royal Arts Foundation in London. The Artisan Honour, a rare award given to those who reshape the role of art in society, was offered to Elijah. He would be the youngest recipient ever. The invitation included a formal presentation, a televised ceremony, and an international broadcast, expected to reach over 80 countries. Elijah's response was brief. He sent back a hand-scored piece of music, titled, "I Am Not the Center." Attached was a note, "If you still want me to come, I will. But I won't arrive to be applauded. I'll arrive to return what was borrowed." The foundation agreed. The ceremony would be revised. No spotlight, no red carpet, just a chair, a stage, and a moment of listening. When the night arrived, Elijah wore no tuxedo. He came barefoot, in a dark linen shirt and plain trousers. His white cane tapped gently against the floor as he stepped into the room filled with ambassadors, artists, and scholars. He said nothing. Instead, he placed a wooden flute on the podium. Then he sat and waited. It wasn't a performance. It was a reminder that art doesn't exist to elevate one person. It exists to remind everyone that they're not alone. And in that quiet hall, as the audience leaned into the stillness, one truth rang louder than any applause. Elijah Rowe didn't need to be a legend to be remembered. He just needed to make sure someone else didn't feel invisible. Elijah Rowe never returned to the spotlight, but the echoes he left behind refused to fade. He didn't sign deals. He didn't form a foundation. Instead, he disappeared into the folds of small towns, distant train routes, and late-night bus stations. His absence wasn't retreat. It was design, because Elijah believed music wasn't meant to follow him. It was meant to follow the listener. Still, stories started to surface. In a rural elementary school outside New Orleans, a substitute teacher discovered a handwritten score taped to the underside of a desk. The title read, "For the Days You Can't Speak." There was no name, but the notation, written in large, uneven letters with pauses longer than notes, bore a distinct pattern, the same one Elijah used during his early recordings. A third-grade girl played it during recess. No one taught her how. She just pressed keys until they sounded like her walk to school. That video, filmed by another student, ended up on a parenting forum. Within 48 hours, it reached over 500,000 views. Across the country, more signs began to appear. A youth shelter in Detroit received a small package. Inside were 10 unique scores and a note that read, "For those waiting for the world to slow down long enough to hear them." There was no signature, no return address, but every composition seemed written not for performance, but for survival. A few used ambient sound, like the tap of fingers on a window pane. Others included instructions like, "Pause after every thought," or "Play barefoot if possible." They weren't songs. They were moments, and they kept arriving. A halfway house in Phoenix, a food pantry in Raleigh, a mobile health clinic in the Bronx. Each place reported receiving music pieces in brown paper envelopes, often with only a few lines of instruction. "This piece belongs to whoever needs it first. You don't have to finish it, just begin." Then came the interview that changed everything. Not with Elijah, but with someone who claimed to have met him. Devin Scott, a 17-year-old visually impaired boy from Vancouver, posted a YouTube video titled, "He Taught Me Without Saying a Word." In it, he described meeting a quiet traveler at a bus terminal in Toronto. The man sat beside him and listened as Devin tapped rhythms on his knees. "He never asked my name," Devin said. "He just handed me a page and said, 'Use it when the world gets too loud.'" The page was a music score, titled "Quiet in Motion." It ended with the phrase, "You are never broken," just waiting for the right tempo. The video exploded, and with it came more stories. A young woman in South Korea posted about a score she found folded into a donated Braille book. A retired nurse in Mississippi claimed a stranger left sheet music under the front door mat of her church. An artist in Buenos Aires said she received a melody carved into wood, wrapped in a scarf with no note attached, and none of them could prove it was Elijah. But somehow everyone knew. Music teachers began compiling these pieces. They called it the Rowe Archive. There was no official catalog, only scans, transcriptions, and personal recordings uploaded by those who received them. Universities took notice. A small liberal arts college in Vermont designed a course called Composition in Absence. Students were asked to compose without structure, without approval, and sometimes without even hearing the results. They were taught to feel their way into someone else's silence. In correctional facilities and shelters, volunteer programs began offering workshops where participants created pieces out of memory. No instruments, just stories. The goal wasn't to perform, it was to express. It wasn't about technique. It was about letting something finally leave the body in sound. The ripple didn't end in education. One winter, a major streaming platform released a short film titled Elijah's Silence. It featured no dialogue, just visuals of the people impacted by his music, some crying, some listening, some simply placing their hands on vibrating floors or old piano keys. There were no credits, only one phrase at the end: "You are not invisible." Back in Vermont, neighbors occasionally said they saw a young black man with a canvas satchel walking along the lake at dawn, always alone, always silent, sometimes humming. One child said he saw him carving notes into tree bark with a pocket knife. But no one chased him, no one tried to film, because by then the world understood what Elijah had been trying to say. Music doesn't need a name. It needs a witness. The Eastbrook Institute had no plans to change until silence made them. Following the gala performance and the viral wave that followed, the school's board of trustees found itself in unfamiliar territory. Donors withdrew funding. Alumni demanded transparency. Over 80 former students signed an open letter titled, "We were taught to play, not to listen." It detailed years of quiet exclusion, coded language, and the unspoken reality that talent was often filtered through wealth, whiteness, and prestige. But it wasn't the headlines that shifted Eastbrook. It was something smaller. An anonymous envelope arrived on the dean's desk, containing only a handwritten note. "What you refused to hear has now become the world's favorite sound. What are you going to do with the silence you're left with?" There was no signature, but everyone knew who it echoed. Within 6 months, the Institute announced the development of a new wing dedicated to inclusive music education, not as an elective, not as outreach, but as core curriculum. It would be called Bell Wing, not after a donor, not after a historical figure, but after the soft chime of a bell heard before class begins. A name chosen to symbolize something that rings out quietly but leaves a lasting tone. The design of Bell Wing reflected everything Eastbrook had once resisted. There were no portraits of famous alumni, no velvet ropes, no audition gates. Instead, the building featured wide corridors with sensory textures built into the walls. Practice rooms had adjustable lighting and tactile floor markers. Sound booths were equipped with real-time haptic feedback so deaf students could compose by vibration. And the most striking feature was the central room, completely silent. No instruments, no furniture, just one smooth stone wall inscribed with braille and raised letters. Music isn't something we master, it's something we remember together. At first, some faculty resisted. A few said the shift diluted Eastbrook's standards. Others resigned quietly, refusing to teach under the new structure. But most stayed. And slowly, something changed. The first students admitted into Bell Wing didn't come with letters of recommendation. Some couldn't read traditional notation. A few were nonverbal. One had never touched an instrument. But within weeks, these same students began composing works that startled even the seasoned instructors. Pieces that reflected environments, emotions, and memories rather than formulas. One composition used only the rhythm of crutches on hardwood floors. Another was built around the sound of paper tearing and being taped back together. There were no grades, only reflections. Students weren't asked to prove they understood music theory. They were asked one question: can someone feel what you're trying to say? And then quietly, the word spread. Other conservatories took notice. A university in Oregon sent faculty to observe. A London academy adopted the Bell Wing model for their early learning program. State education boards began pushing for changes in music curriculum, encouraging schools to integrate access-based methods alongside classical frameworks. Still, Elijah Rowe never returned. He never visited the building, never gave a quote, never attended an unveiling ceremony. He didn't need to, because Bell Wing wasn't built to honor him. It was built to answer him. One day, a first-year student found a sheet of music taped to the inside of a practice booth. No title, no name, only this: for those told music isn't for them, play anyway. The discovery sparked rumors. Had Elijah been there? Did someone plant it in his name? But the staff never confirmed, and that was the point. The revolution he started no longer needed his body to be present, because his presence had become a method. At the end of the first academic year, Bellwing held a public showcase, not to display perfection, but to let students tell their stories. There was no audience in suits, no standing ovation, just families, friends, and neighbors sitting in a circle, listening to music made from things most people throw away, scraps of wood, plastic bottles, whispered lullabies. A 10-year-old blind student named Samara tapped out a melody with her cane and played a piece she'd titled, "The Day I Stopped Apologizing." And when it ended, no one clapped. They listened. Years passed, but the world never stopped telling Elijah Rowe's story, even as he stopped speaking it. There were no documentaries with him as the subject, no memoirs, no stadium tours. The boy who once opened the Global Sound Gala had returned to where his music began, the margins. And still, his influence grew. His name was spoken in schools, whispered in prison music programs, etched onto chalkboards in youth shelters. Yet Elijah himself remained a question mark, a symbol, a presence that didn't occupy stages but settled into everyday lives like a tuning fork pressed against the heart. He became more myth than man, but not because he wanted to be. Because the world needed to believe someone could walk through humiliation, erasure, and silence, and still come out singing without ever asking for attention. The Bellwing School eventually commissioned a memorial, though they didn't call it that. It wasn't a statue, no bronze likeness, no towering tribute, just a circular courtyard paved with white stone, where no shoes were allowed and no speaking was permitted. At its center, a small engraved plaque in Braille and raised lettering read, "The sound you leave behind doesn't need your name to be remembered." No formal announcement accompanied the unveiling, but slowly, visitors began arriving, not because they saw it trending, but because someone whispered to someone else, "If you ever feel like your story doesn't belong, go stand there. The silence will answer you." Across the world, people began holding silent hours in his honor. Community centers dimmed their lights and invited people to sit, listen, and let the quiet remind them they existed. No music, just presence. And from that stillness, creativity bloomed. A school in Kenya built an outdoor amphitheater entirely from recycled materials. Its first concert used instruments crafted from bottles and sticks. The final piece was titled Elijah's Hands. In a village near the Canadian Rockies, an artist with cerebral palsy painted murals based on the rhythmic marks left by her mobility device on pavement. She said she was inspired by a story about a musician who once composed using footsteps. None of these people met Elijah, but all of them heard him. The ripple effect didn't end in music. Policy panels on accessible education began referencing his story. Arts funding in multiple states redirected a portion of their budgets to support non-traditional learners. A grassroots initiative in Boston created an annual scholarship called the Quiet Flame Award for students who had once been told they were too different to lead. And still, Elijah remained out of sight. Until one winter, when a retired professor named Lenore Foster, now in her 70s, walked into a community library in Vermont. She was there for a reading group, but behind the checkout desk, in a wooden frame, was something that made her stop. It was a handwritten score, old, slightly torn but carefully preserved. No title, no signature, just 3 simple instructions written at the bottom. Begin with breath. Leave space for silence. Let someone else finish it. She didn't ask who donated it. She didn't need to. She just stood there, closed her eyes, and listened to the space between the notes. And in that moment, she knew. Elijah had never disappeared. He had multiplied. Because sometimes the greatest legacy isn't the volume of what you say, but the quiet you leave behind that teaches others how to listen.